Scribes beneath the crown prince are attested in legal texts, often as witnesses, but also as a joint debtor of silver, and drawn up after the reign of Assurbanipal. For the farmer, these houses were located in an area also occupied by other functionaries, some of whom belonged to the household of the commander-in-chief. For the servants of the crown prince to occur together with those of the commander-in-chief. Sennacherib erected residences for two of his sons, Assur-nadin-Sumi and Assur-eli-mubalisu, in Assur, and for another son, Assur-samuusabsi, in Nineveh, neither of whom is explicitly known as crown prince. Dates to the reign of Sennacherib, since Nabu-samuiskin is designated chariot driver of Sennacherib. A similar date is assumed for a baker, and, in the case of an Aramean scribe, as a joint seller. Another scribe of the crown prince, Keni, is mentioned in a colophon according to which his son Aplaya drew up the tablet in question for the reading of the crown prince Assurbanipal. Hence scribes of the crown prince might have functioned as his secretaries, but are also associated with the scholarly sphere. While these attestations refer to crown princes active in the 7th century, earlier crown princes must also have had scribes at their disposal, given that Shalmaneser V and Sennacherib sent letters to their fathers, King Tiglath-Pileser III and King Sargon II respectively. In the scholarly realm we find a chief exorcist, an exorcist, 2 diviners, and a physician in the service of the crown prince. Of these the chief exorcist is explicitly said to be of the household of the crown prince when witnessing a slave sale document. According to the exorcist Marduk Sakinsumi, his colleague Ramutu, who is in the service of the crown prince, is ill. The sender lists suitable substitutes, all designated bearded courtiers, S.A. Zikni, from whom the king might choose a replacement to serve the crown prince. Of the 2 diviners, one is a witness in a legal document, while Tabni is known as co-author of several letters and queries. He describes how favor was shown not only to his father, a chief haruspects, but also to himself when he was given as subordinate to the crown prince, and used to have usufruct of the leftovers of the crown prince. Now apparently this situation had changed, and another diviner had been honored by being dressed in purple. Finally, after the reign of Assurbanipal, we encounter Nabusarayur, physician of the crown prince, witnessing a legal document. When discussing scholars serving the crown prince we should mention the scholar, Umanu, Balasi, who is known to have been responsible for the education of the crown prince Assurbanipal, according to his own testimony, in one of his letters to the king. To whom indeed has the king done such a favor as to me, whom you the king have appointed to the service of the crown prince, to be his master, and to teach him? Although Balasi was already regarded as belonging to the king's entourage, it was clearly a great honor to be selected to educate and train the heir to the throne. In other cases it is not so clear whether scholars were being employed to serve the crown prince before he reached maturity. He became chief exorcist in the reign of Assurbanipal. In the very same letter Tabni points out that his father took care of Esarhaddon already when he was a child. The same question arises with regard to other officials beneath the crown prince. In the time span 667 to 660 BCE, when only a child prince par excellence seems possible, that there may have been a nominated crown prince at all times. During the reign of Esarhaddon the crown prince featured prominently within oracle queries, as well as in the king's correspondence with scholars, so it is perhaps not surprising that some scholars were specifically working for the crown prince. Aside from his father, the crown prince was the only person to have scholars at his disposal, since access to scholars, and thus to their wisdom, was highly restricted. This is clear from a letter written to Esarhaddon by the so-called enigmatic informer reporting on Paro, a goldsmith of the household of the queen, who had, like the king and the crown prince, bought a Babylonian to teach his son exorcistic literature and extispicy omens. We found not only functionaries with specific tasks and skills in the service of the crown prince in the 7th century, but also quite a number of Sarezi officials. As the title itself does not illuminate their function, we rely on either the context or on additional titles to determine their spheres of activity. In the case of those Sarezis said to be beneath the crown prince, they mainly appear as parties to legal transactions, eunuch of the crown prince of Babylon, or are listed in administrative records of palace personnel, thus shedding no light on their actual sphere of responsibilities. Nevertheless, few observations can be made by means of prosopography. The eunuch Adur-Eli, leasing the village Baya, and designated team commander, when selling the very same village in 666 BCE, probably held this military function already in 670 BCE. Similarly, Ilbeldoli, known as household overseer of the crown prince, is designated as Sarezi in another tablet. In addition to the king and his closest relatives, crown prince, queen, king's mother, Also higher-ranking officials such as the chief eunuch, the commander-in-chief, and governors are attested with a Sarezi beneath them. Hence, the employment of Sarezis was not restricted to members of the royal family, although in the context of the present study, they may be treated as another sign of the increased size and complexity of the crown prince's household. Further, functionaries whose title reflects status or social rank rather than a particular function include the Marakalis, son of the palace, two of whom are described as of the succession house in legal texts, translated as courtier or palace official and probably featuring a birth and childhood in the palace. They were usually assigned to the palace. The two of the succession house suggest an attribution to the crown prince. The crown prince also had a Markadi in his service, attested as a witness in the reign of Assurbanipal. As far as I am aware, this compound only appears in Neo-Assyrian sources. The term is usually translated as adjutant. Several queries to the sun god were performed in the Bet Redudi, according to a letter that dates to 672 to 669 BCE. Thus Para might actually have been in the service of the king's mother Nakia, as Azara Amit had already died in 673 BCE. This term partially overlaps with that of Rab Ekli, since the Rab Akali Tardamani is once designated Mar Ekli instead, and the office can also be found beneath the chief eunuch and the palace supervisor. The latter's Markadi clearly acted as his master's assistant. The main wife of the crown prince is normally, but not exclusively, designated by the term Balat Bedi, usually translated as Lady of the House. From the reign of Esarhaddon, we not only encounter the Lady of the House herself more frequently, but also some of her subordinates. Now common servants, Urdu, chariot fighters, Mar Damki, a chariot driver, Mukilapati, and a Sakintu, a female administrator are attested beneath her. In the case of common servants and a chariot fighter, the Balat Bedi's association with the crown prince is made explicit, Sa Balat Bedi Samar Sari. It seems clear that in the 7th century not only did the crown prince have a well-developed household of his own, but also his main wife had her own establishment, perhaps even including a military branch, presumably headed by a Sakintu, like the queen, but on a smaller scale. The enhanced status of the crown prince's household is also indicated by military functionaries attached to the crown prince from the reign of Sennacherib onwards. The following military or military-related officials appear in the service of the crown prince, probably a commander of FFTY, Rabban, cohort commanders, Rab Kiri, horse trainers, Sasanu, third men, on chariot, Taslisu, chariot fighters, Mar Damki, chariot drivers, Mukilapati, and prefects, Saknu, as well as information officers, Mirmi. When discussing designations which do not convey a precise function, some are 7th century attestations of common servants, Urdu, beneath the crown prince. Many attestations of the lady of the house presumably refer to the crown prince Assurbanipal, and thus to his main wife Labali Seret. Probably also a eunuch of hers is attested already in the reign of Sargon II. It is exactly this specification which indicates that there existed more than one woman with this status contemporaneously. Note that there is a village manager of the Balat Bedi of the commander-in-chief attested in the later 8th century, a chief fuller, Rab Aslaki, a major domo, a village manager, and probably a eunuch of the crown prince are temporarily assigned to the household of the lady of the house. For a deputy cohort commander of the crown prince, the Rab Kiri also supervised cohorts of craftsmen, instead of commanding a military unit, perhaps since the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III. Horse trainers of the open chariotry. We also FND Sama, a Murabanu, translated as tutor or trainer of horses, of the crown prince, attested in the reign of Sennacherib. Sama is designated as Murabanu of Nergal Sumo, who might have been another crown prince of Sennacherib. Third men, e.g. Aplaya, including the chief third men Sinasaraid, and a deputy third man. Chariot fighters, chariot drivers, the attestation of Belanduri, chariot driver of the crown prince, probably dates to the 8th or early 7th century. Information officers, the cohort commanders beneath the crown prince were some assigned to Sasepe and Sakarbudi units. From the reign of Assurbanipal on, the crown prince also had his own chief eunuch, Rab Sarezi, otherwise only known as one of the 7 highest ranks of state. Based on this evidence, it was already observed that from the reign of Sennacherib on, military forces beneath the crown prince were of considerable size and were organized like palace forces. The military unit beneath the crown prince was presumably separated into the personal forces, equivalent to the corruptive forces of the king consisting of Sakarbudi and Sasepe, and the military forces, comparable to the king's standing army led by the chief eunuch. There remains the question of whether the Soccerbudi officials attested beneath the Crown Prince in the second half of the 8th century indicate that the Crown Prince had his own Kururtu forces already in the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III or Sargon II. Similarly, there is the single attestation of the Suzuni Sasepe beneath the Crown Prince from the reign of Sargon. It might be that while the Crown Prince had his own personal forces already in the later 8th century, he was responsible for his own army only from the reign of Sennacherib on. Both the Soccerbudi as well as the Sasepe are exclusively assigned to the palace, or to the king, and key members of the royal family. The king, the Crown Prince and the king's mother had Soccerbudi officials, with those of the king's mother attested only in the 7th century. As for the Sasepe officials, it seems that they were only attached to the king and the Crown Prince. We may be dealing not only with a sign of the increased military responsibilities of the Crown Prince, but also with a correspondingly greater degree of concern for the security of his person. For the sake of completeness, we should also mention that governors, village managers, and mayors are attested in the service of the Crown Prince in the 7th century. It is only evident for the 7th century that the Crown Prince had his own province probably located in the Assyrian heartland, with its capital at Balu, possibly related to the introduction of a province of the crown. The cohort commander of the Crown Prince Nabusariyur is assigned to the Sasepe, whereas his colleague Zarudi is assigned to the Soccerbudi. Samus-Sariyur and Asuramani, eponym of the year 621 BCE. There are even two subordinates of the chief eunuch of the Crown Prince attested, a scribe and a horse trainer after the reign of Assurbanipal. The introduction of military forces beneath the Crown Prince and the king's mother is related to the designation Kir, Sa, Sinahieraba Esu. Soccerbudi officials beneath the Crown Prince include Nabue Uadina and Marduk Sariyur. Sasepe officials beneath the Crown Prince include Ordubeltu, probably the reign of Assurbanipal, and Manzarn. Note therefore also the Medes and other ethnicities, who were engaged as guards of the Crown Prince Assurbanipal, as suggested on the basis of Esarhaddon's succession treaty. Governors, Elduri in the reign of Assurbanipal, as well as a deputy governor. Village managers, e.g. Seh Mayadi in the reign of Sennacherib. Another mayor of the Crown Prince, Mormuk, is attested. Subordinates of the prince might be those attestations of the Crown Prince's personal estate, managed either by his governor, barley and a wagon ox, or his deputy, governor. Also attested as subordinates of the Crown Prince are two merchants, one of which is said to be of the household of the Crown Prince. Merchants are otherwise specified as being in the service of the household of the Queen, or with their origin. Since Tamkaris are known to have been royal trade agents, their assignment to the household of the Crown Prince and the king's mother supports the impression of a conscious assimilation of these two households to the king's domain. Judging from the evidence discussed, it was only in the 7th century that the household of the Crown Prince employed many of the key officials already found in the king's own establishment. We gain the clear impression that the Crown Prince's household was developing into an alternative royal palace household. This development may have begun at the latest in the second half of the 8th century, when in the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, the Crown Prince Ulialeu, that is, the later King Shalmaneser V, was engaged in state affairs. The same is true for the Crown Prince Sennacherib, who was apparently entrusted with similar responsibilities. It is likely that the Crown Prince generally, at least from the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III on, played a significant role in state affairs, providing that he was old enough. A special case was certainly the double Crown Prince ship of Assurbanipal and Samus-Sumayukin in the years 672 to 669 BCE, when it appears that the Crown Princes became part of the kingship itself, whereas Assurbanipal, as designated heir to the Assyrian throne, may have been occupied with tasks similar to his predecessors. Samus-Sumayukin presumably took on responsibilities over Babylon even before his father's death. Similarly, the Assyrian prince and son of Sennacherib, Asurnadin-Sumi, ruled over Babylonia from 699 down to 694 BCE during his father's reign, until he was captured by the Elamites. In the case of both these Assyrian princes, high-ranking political officials of theirs are attested as witnesses in contemporary Babylonian legal documents, Kuduris. Accordingly, Asurnadin-Sumi had in his service a palace supervisor. Note also the case of and who owes the Crown Prince 300 sheep, Comasian merchants and Egyptian merchants. See letters written by Sennacherib to his father, the letters of the Crown Prince Assurbanipal to the king Esarhaddon. It is assumed that in 671, when Esarhaddon was on campaign in Egypt, Assurbanipal governed in his stead. Also it is assumed that when King Esarhaddon suffered from illness and was not able to govern his country, his role was taken over by Assurbanipal. Although he officially gained the throne of Babylonia only when his father died, the correspondence of Sammusumayukin with the king Esarhaddon suggests that his engagement in Babylonia began prior to that, though it remains unclear whether Sammusumayukin was permanently resident in Babylonia before his father's death. Esarhaddon Sumi was described as Moru Restu, firstborn son, in the inscriptions of Sennacherib. For Sammusumayukin, the following Assyrian offices were installed in Babylonia during his rulership: a vizier, Sakalu, a governor, Sakanmati, a chief eunuch, a palace supervisor, and a palace scribe, as well as a chariot driver. It is not surprising that the Assyrian princes, who were installed as Babylonian rulers, had their own court, and thus their own court officials at hand. Therefore, we have to treat this evidence separately from the evidence pertaining to the designated heirs to the Assyrian throne. On the other hand, this line of inquiry may lead us to another reason for the increase in the size and complexity of the household of the crown prince in Assyria. The introduction of rulership by an Assyrian crown prince over Babylonia in the early 7th century had general implications for the status of the crown prince. If a prince in such an influential position naturally has his own court, then there is all the more reason for the designated heir to the Assyrian throne to have one too. Both developments, the installation of an Assyrian prince in Babylon and the enhanced position of the designated heir to the Assyrian throne, may have originated in the same shift in policy. Strikingly, individuals attested in the latter document can also be found in sources from Assyria, with references. The majority of these offices was most likely only introduced into Babylonia during the period of Assyrian domination, when they mostly appeared for the first time.